Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to my online lectures. This week we are going to do Chapter 21, the Girding for War, the North and the South, 1861 to 1865. This chapter goes into a bit of the early days of secession and the Civil War, and focuses mostly on economic issues between the North and the South. Why the North ended up being superior to the South when it came to economics. And the next chapter, chapter 21, actually talks about the fighting between the North and the South on the battlefield. So if economics is your thing, good. If war is your thing, you have to wait till next week for that one. A couple of things. You have work to do on Google Classroom. You have a test that's due this Saturday, and your historical book review is due this Saturday as well. You need to turn those into me as soon as possible. There is no review for the test other than the weekly questions that I've been giving you. Those will be your questions again for the test. And it's the same thing for the final. There's going to be, I'm going to give you the questions that I'm going to use for the final, or at least where to find the information. But it could be anything from the very beginning of the book to, page 350-ish. So make sure you're starting to look over that information again, looking over your notes from way back when. So let's kick this thing off. Abraham Lincoln gets the distinction of having three beginning of the chapter quotes in this book. He gets chapter 19's quote, chapter 20's quote, and chapter 21's quote. His quote here from May 7th, 1861, just a couple months after he became president. I consider the central idea pervading this struggle is the necessity that is upon us of proving that popular government is not an absurdity. We must settle this question now, whether in a free government the minority have the right to break up the government whenever they choose. If we fail, it will go far to prove the incapability of the people to govern themselves. What Lincoln means by this is that the whole world was watching what happened in America. The whole democratic experiment that had been started in 1776 was on the verge of failure, and the monarchs of Europe were keenly watching to see what would happen between the North and the South, who would win, who would lose, and they were sharpening their knives and getting ready for the recarving of North America if the United States lost. When Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office in March of 1861, he had to secretly slip into Washington, D.C. to be able to be the president of his own country. He wasn't necessarily the president of the United States. He was more keenly the president of the disunited States of America. Before Lincoln even became president, there were already 7 states that had broken off from the United States in protest of his winning the November election. When Lincoln took his oath, the steel girders of the Capitol building were still in view. The Washington Monument sat unfinished. And the once perfect United States was broken. Before the nation was restored and the slaves freed at last, the American people would endure 4 years of anguish and bloodshed, and President Lincoln would face the trials of leadership such has been visited upon few presidents. So if you'll bear with me for a second, let's switch over to the lecture. 20K, Chapter 20, Girding for War. So these are the focus questions that you have on page 312. Not going to go over those because those are your weekly questions that we have you look at anyway. Here's the chronology of events, the order in which the events happen in this chapter. Relatively short compared to other chapters. Here is what I was talking about when Lincoln became president. Between the 1860 election and Lincoln's inauguration on March 4th, these 7 states all broke away from the United States and claimed that they were part of the Confederacy. 4 more states would join shortly after Lincoln takes office. So, Lincoln is now president of a disunited states, and his inaugural address is firm yet conciliatory. Lincoln claimed that there would be no conflict unless provoked, and also the whole idea of secession was wholly impractical because, as Lincoln put it, physically speaking, we cannot separate. And this was a profound geographical truth because there is no dividing line between the states. There's no natural boundary between the North and the South. It's just a line on the map. If it was east and west of the Mississippi versus east of the Mississippi, there's a clear line there called the Mississippi River. If it was East Coast versus the rest of the country, there's the Appalachian Mountains. There's a clear line there as well. But there is no line between Kentucky and Tennessee other than a line on a map. It's all political boundaries. And so Lincoln was true in that there is no separation between the states. Secession would also create new controversies. If the South continued to stay broken away from the United States, what would their share of the national debt be? How can Congress give away that debt that's owed by those 11 states and give it to them and let them deal with it? How would they deal with jointly held federal territories? You know, more Southerners fought in the Mexican War than from the North and from the Midwest. So doesn't the South have more claim to the Southern territories held by the United States? And then also, how would the fugitive slave issue be handled? Because now surely that the South is separate from the North, fugitive slaves only have to cross the Ohio River into Ohio instead of all the way to Canada to be able to get their freedom. So these are the questions that are looming with secession starting in 1861. It was absolutely paramount that the United States remain united. For one thing, we were the biggest and most enduring republic in the Western Hemisphere. The old Spanish colonies that had declared their independence from Spain so many years ago had gone through political revolution after political revolution, but the United States remained united up until 1860. If we remained hostile against each other, European nations could then transplant their concept of a balance of power, and Britain and France eagerly looked at the territory to the west in the United States and playing a game of divide and conquer, inciting one side against the other to weaken both sides and allow Europeans to get back into North America. So another issue with secession is, what about federal property in the South? When the war hasn't even really started yet, it's just secession. When the southern states seceded, federal forts in the South were seized. They seized arsenals, mints, public property within their state borders. When Lincoln took office, there were only 2 forts left in the South that were occupied by federal troops. And the biggest and the most important of them was Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. This was a fort that had been built in the 1820s during the era of good feelings to protect Charleston from a possible, future one-day British attack on the South. It was built to protect the harbor. And the American troops, the federal troops who were there at Charleston, Fort Sumter, they would only have enough food and supplies to last for a couple of more weeks. And if they didn't get any more supplies, the fort would have to surrender. They would have nothing left to feed. Lincoln felt that it was his personal obligation to protect the federal property at all costs. And besides that, allowing the fort to surrender would not look good on his resume as a wartime president. Here is a picture of Fort Sumter during the actual barrage from Charleston Harbor. And here's the reason why Fort Sumter, or one of the reasons why Fort Sumter was such an easy target, is that if you look here, all the guns, all the cannons on these 4 sides here are pointed out to the Atlantic Ocean. This fort was built to defend Charleston against incoming ships. This whole backside of the fort, where all these buildings and offices and barracks and stuff are, is pointing towards Charleston. There's no cannons pointing at Charleston. It wasn't built to ever fight Charleston. It was built to fight incoming ships into the harbor. So Lincoln sought a middle-of-the-road solution. Messages were sent to South Carolina saying that they were going to only resupply the fort, not reinforce it. In Southern eyes, a provision was just another way of saying reinforcement. And so when a Union naval force started on its way, cannons of the South Carolina Charleston Harbor opened fire on the fort. It took 34 hours for the bombing to last until the garrison of Fort Sumter surrendered. And you can imagine the party. All Americans love a good fireworks show, unless you're the one receiving the fireworks. And Charleston was a big party during this happening. Bands were playing, people were cheering, ladies and children were sitting on the beaches watching the show happen. It was a big hurrah. This assault did more than anything else to provoke the North, because up until this point, most Northerners didn't care that the South seceded. The overwhelming Northern impression of the whole thing was, let sisters part their ways. If they want to do things their way, so be it. We're free of them, and we'll see who comes crawling back to who. The assault on the fort changed that. And on April 15th, Lincoln issued a call to the states for 75,000 militiamen, and it was met. On April 19th and April 27th, President Lincoln proclaimed a blockade of the southern seaports, which meant he was going to send U.S. Navy ships down to the southern ports to keep them from being able to trade with outside and receive supplies from other countries, or to ship things out from other countries. But also, that call for troops aroused the South. They saw Lincoln as waging war on the Confederacy, and those last 4 states, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, all decided to go ahead and split off from the Union and become part of the Confederacy. And here's the map on page 315 in your book. It's just like the one on the other page, except it has or on the other slide, except it has the dates which the states seceded from the Union. Now, Lincoln's inaugural address about the geographical oddity of secession was especially true for the border states. There were 4 slave-holding states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, who decided not to break away from the United States, but to remain free, or to remain slave states within the United States. Those 4 states contained a white population that was more than half of the entire Confederacy. So they were very important in maintaining a Union dominancy, or a future dominancy over the South. Another geographical question was here. Maryland was a slave state, and if it broke away from the United States, Washington, D.C. would be completely surrounded by the Confederacy. It would be cut off from the rest of the United States. So President Lincoln actually acted a little bit like a tyrant in this case, and he declared martial law in parts of Maryland and sent Union soldiers into parts of Maryland to maintain control of it, to make sure that the secessionists in Maryland didn't convince everybody else from breaking away from the United States. Union troops were also sent into Western Virginia, which became a state in 1863, and into Missouri to maintain Union sympathy in the area. Lincoln is quoted as saying, concerning the border state of Kentucky, Lincoln reportedly said that he hoped to have God on his side, but he had to have Kentucky. Now, the North's war goals were influenced by the border states. When the war started, it wasn't about slavery. It was about whether or not states had the right to break away from the United States. Lincoln was obliged to declare not fighting to free the blacks. He didn't want to discourage or dissatisfy the 4 border states who were still sticking with the Union. To Lincoln, the paramount purpose of the war was to save the Union. There were other slave areas of the country, like in the Western Indian Territory. Some Indians even owned slaves, and so they too split on the issue of North versus South. The Cherokees and the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes sided with the Confederacy and even supplied Indians to fight for the Confederacy, whereas the Northern Plains tribes often sided with the Union when it came to the Civil War. But this conflict truly was a brothers' war. There were many instances where one brother rode north to fight with the blue and another south to fight with the gray. Cousin versus cousin. It was truly a war of brothers. In fact, in one instance, Senator Crittenden of Kentucky fathered 2 sons, one of which became a general in the Union Army, and the other one a general in the Confederate Army, fighting against each other on 2 different sides. Now, in the beginning of the war, the South had quite a few great advantages when it came to fighting a war. We had talked in a previous chapter how if the war had started in 1850, the South would have probably most definitely won. but they still had quite a few advantages in 1861 as well. This was a war that was quite a bit like the American Revolution in that it was a defensive war. In the American Revolution, we didn't have to send troops to England to fight in England to gain our independence. All we had to do was defend against whoever England sent to fight us. The South didn't have to go and take over the rest of the North to maintain its legitimacy. All it had to do was fight defensively behind its lines, and the North would have to be the one to spend all the time and money and manpower of getting to the South to fight. This was not a war of independence that they had to win. Just like the American Revolution, all they had to do was fight the North to a standstill and stand firm. Eventually, if they fought long enough, the North would stop sending troops. Southerners saw this as a fight for self-determination, of being able to make their own rules, and a preservation of their way of life. And so initially, because it was a war of wills, they enjoyed a high morale at the beginning. And then finally, the South had probably the most talented officers in all the Civil War. The South had Robert E. Lee, who had initially been offered a leadership position in the Union Army by President Lincoln, but when Virginia decided to secede from the United States, Robert E. Lee went with his home state and went to fight for the Confederacy. Lee's chief lieutenant general was a man named Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who was a brilliant military tactician. On top of that, besides the talented military officers of the South, Southerners had been bred to fight their whole lives. They had been born on the backs of horses and were riding from infancy and shooting from infancy, and made excellent marksmen. And that pretty much does it for any advantages that the South had, because immediately from the beginning of the war, the South was handicapped by their lack of factories. Troops managed to obtain weaponry early in the war by seizing federal arsenals and supplies, but as the war dragged on, shortages of supplies afflicted the South. Both civilians and soldiers went hungry because of supply problems. And we're talking about a huge agricultural society. There should be nobody starving in the South if everything is farmland, but so much of the land was devoted to cotton that they had to go and regrow food for the war effort. They had to grow more corn, they had to grow more wheat for the war effort. And then, on top of that, they had a breakdown in their transportation system, because there wasn't much of a transportation system in the South to begin with. The South did not have the railway networks that the North did, and didn't have the road systems and canal systems that the North did. And so there was a breakdown of the South's transportation system as the system fell apart. The economy was the North's greatest strength. They not only had a huge farm economy, but also a sprawling factory. You had farms in the Midwest providing wheat and grain for the war effort. Not only enough for the Union to eat, but also enough to export to other countries. And also a huge factory growth in the Northeast. About 3/4 of the nation's wealth resided in the North. And on top of that, they had 3/4 of the 30,000 miles of railroad tracks in the United States. The North also had a control of the sea. Early on in the war, we talked about how Lincoln he ordered a blockade of southern ports. So that choked off the South from supplies. And then grain was exchanged for munitions and supplies from Europe. So whatever the North couldn't provide for itself, they were able to buy very easily from England and France and other European countries to supply the massive amount of soldiers that the South was able to put on the field. The Union also had a much larger manpower reserve. The North had about 22 million people living in it, while the South only had 9 million people, and that included about 3.5 million slaves who would not be fighting for the most part. And on top of that, the Union continued to gain people during the time of the war as immigrants continued to come to the United States. Now, Northern boys were much less prepared for war than their Southern counterparts, but they eventually became a well-disciplined fighting force. One unfortunate part that the North had was its higher commanders, its generals, and its leadership. Lincoln did not have a good cadre of officers to draw from because all of his best officers went and joined the South. So Lincoln had to pick and choose officers by a inefficient trial by fire basis. Basically, you had to take people at their word that they were good military officers, and then when they failed, replace them with somebody else who said was a good military officer. And it wasn't until 1863 that Lincoln was able to find his military officer that was going to win the war for him, being Ulysses S. Grant after the Battle of Vicksburg. Here is the table that is on page 317 in your book. And you can see here that with the exception of 1861 and 1862, when immigration dropped quite a bit, 63 and 64, it almost doubled between those 2 years. Between 1862 and 1864, the immigration amount doubled. And in 1865, we had 248,000 immigrants coming to the United States. Now, granted, only the first 3 months of the war, only the first 3 months of the war were war months, but still, immigration continued to come to the United States rather than stay away. Here are some posters trying to enlist immigrants into the Union Army. There were several different Irish brigades in the Union Army, one of them being the 69th Irish out of New York. Here is a poster in German to enlist German immigrants to fight for the Union. You can see that if you made it through the war, you got a $100 bonus when the war was over or when you were discharged. And here you got a $160 bounty if you enlisted in the this German company. So the Northern strengths outweighed those of the South. When the war began, the chances for Southern independence were favorable, but there were a couple of turn of events that produced a different outcome for the South. And so when you look at the beginning of the Civil War, there are quite a few might-have-beens that are pretty fascinating. If the South was able to convince the border states to secede from the United States, if Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri had decided to, or maybe just one or two of them more had decided to fight for the South instead, the South probably would have won. If certain states had turned against the Union, so that's the border states back again, if uncertain states had turned against the Union, the South might have won. The upper Mississippi Valley states, Illinois, Missouri, we've already talked, Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, those states in the very upper Mississippi River area, they depended quite a bit on the Mississippi River for selling through New Orleans, of getting stuff down the river to New Orleans to sell. And there were quite a few Southern sympathizers in those states. If they had turned against the Union, the country would have been broken on a physical barrier, the Mississippi River. If Britain had decided to side with the Confederates and had broken the naval blockade and provided the South with supplies, the South might well have won. All of those possibilities almost became realities, but none of them actually occurred. And so the South could not win. One of the things that the South was banking on that didn't happen was the world's dependency on King Cotton. Of all of the assets that the Confederacy possessed, none counted more than foreign intervention. And they truly believed the hope was alive that just like in the American Revolution, how France had interceded on the side of the United States, the Confederacy believed that a foreign power is going to intercede on their behalf and help fight the war with them. Europe's ruling classes were sympathetic to the South. Remember, the South had an aristocratic air to it. But the British common folk were very hostile to any intervention on behalf of the South. Why should the wage slaves of London be helping the real slaves of the South with their hard-earned tax money? But the British textile mills did still depend on the South for 75% of their cotton. And so Southerners counted on that economic need to bring Britain to their aid. So with cotton being so important to the British economy, why didn't the British come? Well, King Cotton failed. The years before the Civil War, 1857 to 1860, had been such enormous production years for Southern cotton that British manufacturers had surpluses of cotton in their warehouses and didn't need to immediately bring more cotton to Great Britain. On top of that, the Confederates were so sure that Britain was going to need their cotton that they burned about 2 million pounds of their own cotton in 1861 and 1862 to get rid of their cotton excess so that there would be a bigger need on the market for it. The Union also was able to capture or buy considerable supplies of cotton and ship them to Britain when cotton did run out in the British warehouses. But the South isn't the only place around the world that can grow cotton. It grows cotton well, but there's other places as well, including Egypt and India. And during the American Civil War, the British influence in Egypt and the British influence in India increased their cotton output to supply the mills in England. There were two other agricultural kings that were more important than cotton during the Civil War, and that was King Wheat and King Corn. Northern agriculture grew like gangbusters during this time period. They had ideal weather and great harvests. They were able to feed the entire country, and agricultural machines started appearing on the scene, like the McCormick Reaper, that were more efficient at cutting grain and freed up more manpower for the war. Here is a graphic. This is in French, but this was contemporary to the 1860s. And you can see here, the blue represents cotton from America. The yellow represents cotton from India. And the tan here or the brown represents cotton from Egypt. And you can see in 1858, most of the cotton that went to England came from the United States, and most of the cotton that went to Europe came from the United States. By 1864, this had shifted quite a bit, where most of the cotton that was coming to England, most of the cotton that was going to England came from India instead, and by 1865, they were getting quite a bit from India, quite a bit from Egypt, and also some from South America. And then Europe was getting supplied with cotton from England. It would go through England first and then into Europe. When it came to foreign diplomacy, the British were still interested in helping the Confederates because they saw the dollar signs in it. In 1861, there was something called the Trent Affair, where a Union warship stopped a British mail steamer called the Trent off the coast of Cuba. 2 Confederate diplomats were forcibly removed from the ship. The British were outraged and war preparations were buzzed. Several regiments of British troops were prepared to send to Canada to defend the Canadian border against and possibly invade the North. And as the soldiers boarded the ships going to Canada, the band played Dixie, or I Wish I Was in Dixie, if you know it by that term. But the slow communications between England and the United States gave passions a chance to cool, and nothing ever came from it. Lincoln later released the prisoners from the Trent, and it was all laid to rest. But the British were still building ships, and if you have enough money, anybody can buy a ship, even if it's a warship. So another crisis arose when the British built a warship called the Alabama for the Confederate commerce raiders. The Alabama was a fast-moving, lightly armed ship that was designed to disrupt commerce, and they were able to skirt the law for neutrality by not putting any guns on it while it was being built. They instead let the Alabama leave port or leave England. It left the shipyards unarmed, and then 2 British Navy ships followed it to a small group of islands off the coast of Spain, where it then transferred over the cannons to the Alabama and the crew over to the Alabama, and it went out to do destruction. It captured more than 60 vessels during its time, during its goose chase around the world, until it was finally sunk in 1864 by a Union cruiser off the coast of France. So that's just one ship. How could this really affect the Confederacy? Well, in 1863, 2 ironclad warships called the Laird Rams were constructed for the Confederacy. Now, ironclads start to be built during the 1850s, and they really come into their own in the 1860s. An ironclad is a ship that has a iron exterior, and therefore it's less susceptible to cannonballs, and it's a harder ship to sink than the old wooden ships. And the ironclads really had a huge advantage over the older wooden ships just because of their construction. But these Laird ships had iron rams that were underneath the waterline. So this ship was designed to be able to sail straight into wooden ships and sink them by breaking the waterline underneath the enemy ship. If these ships had been delivered to the South, they would have sunk the blockading squadrons by ramming into them and then they would have been free to just do whatever they wanted to do, use their cannons to fire on northern cities. America's Minister to Britain, Charles Francis Adams, another Adams from the President Adams series, warned that war would happen if the rams were released. And so London eventually came to its senses and decided that the Confederacy didn't need those ships after all, and they bought them for the Royal Navy instead, leaving the Confederates quite disappointed. Here's a picture of one of the ships as it was being constructed. You can see here in the image that it's made out of metal, okay? But here's the part that's the ram, this protrusion here. The water line on this ship when it's in the water would come to about right here. So this whole bulb, you wouldn't even see this underneath the water when it's underway, but about 10-15 feet out in front of the ship, all it had to do was just run into you, and this whole piece of metal would be jammed into your ship, sinking you. The French also had their eyes on North America, and in 1863, Emperor Napoleon III of France dispatched a French army to occupy Mexico City. It's not like Napoleon III just woke up one day and said, hey, you know what, we're going to send an army to Mexico. There were actually quite a bit of debts that Mexico had not paid back to the French, and so the French sent an army to basically collect by seizing the country of Mexico. Emperor Napoleon III obviously can't rule France and Mexico, so he gets one of his cousins, the Archduke Maximilian from Austria, who he lets be the Emperor of Mexico. And both of those actions, sending an army to occupy Mexico City and installing an emperor over the country of Mexico, were both violations of the Monroe Doctrine. Napoleon was actually gambling that the Union would collapse, that the United States would not be able to defeat the Confederacy, and that they would both be perpetually fighting each other, and therefore America would be too weak to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. Unfortunately for Napoleon III, and really unfortunately for Maximilian, in 1865, when the war was over, the United States Secretary of War started preparing soldiers to go south to Mexico. And so Napoleon decided that he wasn't going to send any more troops to Mexico, and he stopped reinforcing in 1867. And the puppet emperor of Mexico, Maximilian, was captured by Benito Juarez's Mexican troops and executed. What's really sad about the whole Maximilian thing is that despite being an emperor, a European emperor over the Mexicans, Maximilian was really concerned with reforming Mexico, of making it a better country. And he, unlike other Europeans, had a real interest in making it a better place. Him and his wife both learned Spanish before they even went to Mexico, so they would be better prepared to live there. And he was eventually executed. So let's talk about more weaknesses, and we'll compare Presidents Jefferson Davis versus Abraham Lincoln for this. The Confederate government's fatal weakness was that they were built on secession. If the 11 states who seceded from the United States wanted to then leave the Confederacy, it couldn't logically deny future secessions of its constituent states. If Texas and Louisiana wanted to split away from the Confederacy and become their own country, how could the Confederacy stop them? Jefferson Davis, who had been a former Secretary of State of the United States, and he'd been a congressman and all sorts of stuff, Jefferson Davis had in idea a well-knit central government type idea for the Confederacy, which flew right in the face of the states' rights supporters who wanted something similar to the Articles of Confederation back during the American Revolution, where the states have the ultimate decision in their own affairs, and that's that. There was a particular problem in trying to get soldiers to fight outside of their own state borders, that the Texas troops didn't want to leave Texas because they would be leaving their home. In case of an attack, they wouldn't be able to defend their homes. And so that was an ongoing problem during the Civil War for the Southern forces. President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy was tense, he was humorless, he was legalistic and stubborn. At no time during his time as president of the Confederacy did he enjoy any real personal popularity with the people of his country. He couldn't do the things that he needed to do because of disputes between him and his Congress. And he defied rather than leading public opinion. He would overwork himself with the details of both civil government and military operations. And ultimately, the task of president was beyond his powers of being able to handle all those tasks. Lincoln, on the other hand, had less trouble prostrating himself. Or actually, Lincoln had his problems were less prostrating, and he was able to surmount them. The North had a long-established government. It wasn't like they were just restarting from nothing. It was financially stable. It was fully recognized abroad. They could take out loans from other countries and be able to repay them. Lincoln was more superior when it came to flexibility, but Davis was actually more experienced in upper-level government than Lincoln. But Lincoln was tactful, he was quiet, he was patient but firm, and he surrounded himself with advisors who knew things better than him, and he learned from them. And when they failed him, he replaced them and continued to grow. Lincoln developed what the book calls a genius, and that he interpreted and led public opinion during the war. He showed charitableness towards the South. He let his competitors and his backbiting colleagues say what they were going to say, because ultimately Lincoln understood that if you got into a personal fight with every single person who disagreed with you, you would never get anything done, which is kind of what happened to Davis in the South. Lincoln's greatest challenge during this whole war was preserving the Union while upholding constitutionally protected freedoms. There were a lot of things that were not in the Constitution that the Civil War infringed upon when it came to people's personal liberties. He abridged some civil liberties to quell the rebellion. Quite a few people actually don't like Lincoln for this. He went outside of Congress using Congress recess time to be able to raise the size of the army and to order troops around, which is something that only Congress can do. He also advanced federal funds to private citizens without appropriation and suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the war. Critics called him the Simple Susan tyrant for his iron-handed authority. But Lincoln also believed that his iron-fisted policies would be only temporary, in that, when you're sick, you take bitter medicine, but you don't continue taking the medicine after you're well, and that habeas corpus would be restored and martial law would be revoked once the war was over and the United States had won. Here are portraits, Jefferson Davis on the left and Abraham Lincoln on the right. All right, so let's talk about the war and its demand for men. War demanded men, and lots of them. At first, the Union Army was manned by volunteers until 1863, when Congress passed a nationwide federal conscription law for the first time that drafted people to join the Army. The provisions were grossly unfair to the poor. The rich could hire substitutes or purchase exemptions. You could hire somebody to go fight for you if you were drafted, and you could outright pay $300 and not have to go at all. And the book references on page 319 John D. Rockefeller, who was a young man at the time, paying an exemption instead of going to fight. The draft was especially damned in the Democratic strongholds of the North, like New York. And in 1863, there were actually New York draft riots between the underprivileged and anti-black Irish Americans who were shouting "down with Lincoln" and "down with the draft." And for several days, the New York draft riots put the city at the mercy of the rampaging, pillaging mob. Scores of lives were lost, and the victims included many lynched blacks. The South also first relied on volunteers, but the Confederacy had way fewer people than the North. Remember, the South only has about 5.5 million white people living in it, and the North has 22 million. The Confederacy was so much less populous than the North, and as early as April 1862, the Confederate government was forced to start drafting people. Just like in the North, a rich man could hire a substitute or purchase an exemption, but in the South there was another exemption, that if you were a slave owner or an overseer with 20 slaves or more, you could claim an exemption from the fight. So on both sides, the North and the South, this truly was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, because the poor were disproportionately the ones fighting. Here's an image from page 320 of an amputation at a battlefield in Virginia. The surgeon in this picture is wearing the hat and the sword, and he amputates the leg of a soldier while an anesthesist, the one facing the camera here, is holding a sponge dipped in chloroform over the patient's nose. Some of you have seen this video before, but I'll include a video in the link of a reenactment of a amputation, and I hope you enjoy it. Now, the North was blessed with the lion's share of wealth. They had taxes on tobacco and alcohol that were substantially increased by Congress to provide revenue for the war. An income tax was first applied during the war for the first time. And in 1861, Congress passed what's called the Morrill Tariff Act that increased the existing duties and raised additional revenue providing protection for manufacturers, basically reinforcing the northern manufacturing powerhouse. But that wasn't enough money. The Washington Treasury also started issuing paper money for the first time, called greenbacks. Now, this wasn't the first time we had paper money in the world, or the first time in the United States, but it was the first time the United States government legitimately did it through the Treasury. Its value was determined by the nation's credit, and it fluctuated with the success or failure of the Union Army. The Washington Treasury printed out something near $450 million worth of greenbacks during the war. And because it was backed by popularity, there was one point during the war where the value of the greenback was only 39 cents to the gold dollar. Borrowing outstripped greenbacks and taxes, and in 1863 a national banking system was established that stimulated the sale of government bonds and established a standard banknote currency. If you were a banker and you were interested in being part of the national banking system, you could take your bank's money and buy bonds from the federal government that would be paid back at a later date, and then you would issue your currency based off of the value of that bond. So this provided for a sound paper money that was issued by banks that joined, and became the start of the Federal Reserve System that would start in 1913. Now, the South was beset by financial woes from the beginning. Of course, the custom duties were choked off by the blockade, so they couldn't get revenue from bringing stuff in from outside. And then the Confederacy also had to resort to selling bonds at home and abroad. They increased taxes sharply and imposed a levy on farm produce. But because the states' rights Southerners were looking for an Articles of Confederation-style government, they opposed this taxation. And so the Confederacy was also forced to start printing their own currency that they called the bluebacks, and runaway inflation resulted. They printed close to $1 billion worth of Treasury notes, and at their lowest point, a Confederate paper dollar was worth only 1.6 cents when Robert E. Lee surrendered. Overall, the war inflicted about a 9,000% inflation rate on the Confederacy, and only about an 80% inflation on the Union. If you'll look at this chart here, you'll see the inflation based on gold price of the Confederate currency versus the gold price, and you can see in the last months of the war, from March until April, the inflation rate just skyrockets over close to 6,000% on this chart. Now, the North enjoyed a huge economic boom in the Civil War. Wartime prosperity was rampant in the North. New factories were built because of the new protective tariffs, so more production was needed. Soaring prices resulted from inflation, which did pinch laborers and white-collared workers. And manufacturers and business people raked in tons and tons of cash in the fortunes of war. There were quite a few dishonest manufacturers who would sell old horses and shoddy equipment to the North to make a quick buck. Uniforms that would fall apart during the first rainstorm. Shoes that had cardboard as insoles. The war made people fantabulously wealthy during the time, bringing about more millionaires in or millionaires in the first time in American history, and there were lots of unscrupulous manufacturers. Labor-saving machinery was newly invented. We talked a couple chapters ago about the sewing machine being invented. Well, the sewing machine was put to work making all the equipment for the Union Army, the uniforms, the pants, the shoes. Well, yeah, there were special sewing machines for leather. The tents, the canvas goods, all that stuff needed to be sewn, and the sewing machine was pumping out the material. A mechanical reaper, it's what I was talking about with the wheat fields. A man named McCormick developed a machine where instead of one man with a scythe out in a field breaking his back all day, the mechanical reaper could be pulled by animals, and it just gently cut the wheat down at the ground and laid it over and stacked it up for bundling, which made the process a lot quicker. In 1859, the petroleum industry kicks off, and they discover oil in Pennsylvania, and that's the birth of a new industry. Now, all of a sudden, you don't need to have whale oil for illumination or whale oil to lubricate machines. You now have natural petroleum coming out of the ground to be able to make kerosene for lamps and for lighting, and to be able to make oil for machines to run off of. Pioneers during this time period continued to push westward, even during the middle of the war, brought to the west by the allure of gold and free lands under the Homestead Act of 1862. Now, it's easy to forget about women during the Civil War because we think of the fighting, but the Civil War was a woman's war also. This is one of those instances that you'll see time and time again as wars happen in the United States. But when men leave to go to war, somebody still has to do the jobs that they left behind. And the Civil War was no exception. When men left to go to war, the women took their jobs, mostly industrial jobs of working behind machines. Some women even stepped up to the fighting and posed as male soldiers or served as spies on both sides. In 1861, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell helped organize the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which would assist Union armies in the field, and they would train nurses, they would collect medical supplies, and they would equip hospitals. At home, you could even contribute to the war effort by knitting socks and garments for soldiers that would then be distributed by the U.S. Sanitary Commission. Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix helped transform nursing into a respected profession in the United States. And in the South, Sally Tompkins ran a Richmond infirmary for wounded Confederate soldiers. Northern and Southern women organized bazaars and fairs that raised money for the relief of widows, orphans, disabled soldiers, to buy sanitary goods for soldiers, and to help out with the war effort in general. Here's a graphic that's from page 322 in your book. The photograph there is from the Chicago Sanitary Fair, where they raised funds for soldier relief efforts. And up in the top left, there are two pot holders that have two black people dancing, and it says in there, "Any holder but a slave holder." And those were goods that you could buy from that fair to raise money for the relief of soldiers. In the end, the South fought to exhaustion. They suffered from a suffocation because of the blockade and a total destruction of the South because of the northern invaders that came through the South during the Civil War. In 1860, before the war, the South possessed 30% of the nation's wealth, and by 1870, they possessed only 12% of the nation's wealth. Southern transportation system collapsed, and the northern captains of industry conquered the southern lords of the manor. Cotton capitalism lost out to industrial capitalism as a result of the war. And there we have it. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I hope it clears up some of what you've been reading through my descriptions of things. I'm going to put a couple of video links in the description. One of them in particular is that amputation video that I would normally share during class time. Another one of the videos is a recording. It's not a video itself, but it's a recording of a Southerner who had fought during the Civil War, recording what the rebel yell sounded like. It's very bone-chilling and very scary to listen to, and you can imagine 1,000 men all screaming it at one time while you're standing on the battlefield. I'm also going to include some links to some PBS shows that have come out in recent years. One of them being a drama called Mercy Street, that is about a Civil War soldiers' hospital that is in a southern sympathizing area of a border state. And it's quite a drama piece, but I think you'll enjoy it as well. Best regards. Remember that you have a test this weekend that's due on Saturday, so don't wait until 11 o'clock Saturday night to try to do it. It won't be available for you after that. And you do have a final coming up. I think starting May 10th, you can do the final, and I'll have a review up for that on Google Classroom. Bye, everybody. I will catch you the next time.